The 6th of June, 1944. Allied infantry and armored divisions begin landing on the Normandy coast in France. This largest seaborne invasion in history marks a turning point in World War II and becomes the beginning of the end of the war in Europe. On the following month, in July 1944, the Soviet forces liberate Majdanek, the first major Nazi camp, located in German-occupied Poland. Only after the liberation of the concentration camps, the full extent of Nazi horrors is finally exposed to the world. Because of the demands of forced labor and the lack of food, only a small percentage of concentration camp inmates survive. Compounded by months and years of mistreatment and torture, they resemble skeletons, and many of them are so weak that they can hardly move at all. One of the most infamous perpetrators of this criminal Nazi regime responsible for these atrocities is Hermine Braunsteiner. Hermine Braunsteiner was born on the 16th of July, 1919, in Austrian Vienna as the youngest of 7 children. Hermine's father, Friedrich, was a butcher, and her mother, Maria, earned her living as a laundrywoman. The family home was apolitical and was marked by a good family relationship and strict Catholic upbringing. Between 1925 and 1933, Braunsteiner attended elementary school and then high school. Hermine was a good student and wanted to achieve something. Her dream was to work as a nurse, but she had to give it up due to financial reasons. Instead, Hermine had to help at home, and after her father died from cancer and mother stopped getting the annuities, she became the only provider for the family. To improve her financial situation, Braunsteiner left to her sister for the Netherlands, where she wanted to find a job. However, she could not get a work permit and went back to Vienna after only 3 months. When in the spring of 1938, Adolf Hitler annexed the federal state of Austria into the German Reich, Hermine Braunsteiner was in England working as a housekeeper at an American engineer's household. The Anschluss, as it became known, took place over 3 days between the 11th and 13th of March, 1938. The Anschluss was supported by many Austrians, among them Austrian Nazis, who saw it as a political, social, and cultural reunification with their brother country Germany. Thousands turned out to greet Adolf Hitler, the native son who was returning to his homeland. For Austria's approximately 200,000 Jews, the Anschluss marked a terrible turning point. Beginning on the night of the 11th of March, and in the weeks that followed, there was pogrom-like violence across the country. Austrian Nazis and others beat up, attacked, and humiliated the Jews. They forced Jews to scrub the streets, clean public toilets, and perform humiliating exercises. Many decided to try to leave Austria, and lines appeared at consulates across the city of Vienna. When Hitler returned home to Berlin, he was greeted as a hero. The Anschluss was the Nazi German regime's first act of territorial aggression and expansion. Even though the leaders of the West saw the Anschluss as an invasion, not one government made a move to stop Hitler, who without interference felt free to embark upon the next step in his scheme to conquer all of Europe. When in May 1938, Braunsteiner returned to Vienna, she became a German citizen. For a small salary, she returned to work at the brewery, where she had worked for a short time before she left for England. Because she failed to get an education as a nurse, Hermine signed up to the Viennese Employment Bureau and got assigned to an ammunition factory located in Grüneberg next to Berlin, where she began to produce bullets in August 1938. Out of the 16 marks she earned weekly, she paid 5 for rent and spent the rest to buy a travel ticket to work and to support her mother, who lived in Vienna. Braunsteiner worked there until August 1939, when at the age of 19, she applied for the position of a supervisor at Ravensbrück concentration camp. The main reason she applied was the money. The salary was 60 marks per week. Ravensbrück, opened in May 1939, was the only major women's camp established by the Nazis. In total, some 132,000 women from all over Europe passed through the camp, including Poles, Russians, Jews, Gypsies, and others. Of that number, over 92,000 women perished. Ravensbrück camp was staffed both by SS men, who served as guards and administrators, and by 150 women, who served as supervisors. These female supervisors were either SS volunteers or women who had taken the job for the good pay and working conditions. Ravensbrück also housed a training camp for female SS guards, who were trained here how to handle the prisoners that they were going to supervise. These prisoners would have to work until they died, and the task of their supervisors, such as Hermine Braunsteiner, was to get the maximum amount of work out of them whilst they were still alive. About 3,500 women were trained at Ravensbrück and went on to serve either there or at other concentration camps. Through the eager fulfillment of her responsibilities, Hermine Braunsteiner rose rapidly in the overseer hierarchy. From the beginning of 1941, she took over the management of the so-called Kleiderkammer, clothing magazines. In April 1942, Maria Mundel was promoted to the rank of senior supervisor at Ravensbrück. Mundel supervised daily roll calls and punishments such as beatings and floggings, and she also selected women for human experiments. Her duties also included overseeing the work assignments of the guards that she supervised. Among them was Hermine Braunsteiner. A disagreement with Mundel led Braunsteiner to request a transfer, and in October 1942, she was relocated to the Majdanek concentration camp in Nazi-occupied Poland. During the entire period of its existence, the Majdanek camp was under construction. Between the 29th of April 1942 and the 3rd of November 1943, Jewish prisoners were the overwhelming majority of prisoners registered at Majdanek. Majdanek also contained storage facilities for clothing and personal items stolen from the Jews before their deaths in Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka II killing centers. Hermine worked in such storage facility, and she also supervised female prisoners who sorted and repaired clothes. From the beginning of January 1943, she stayed at the female field at Majdanek, where Polish prisoners were directed. In the winter of 1941 to 1942, camp authorities began to use Zyklon B gas to murder prisoners who were too weak to work in a makeshift gas chamber. Mass murder operations using poison gas began at Majdanek in October 1942 and continued until the end of 1943. There appear to have been 3 gas chambers at Majdanek. At least 2 were shower rooms reconfigured for the use of Zyklon B gas. At least one of these was used to kill human beings. The SS killed tens of thousands of Jews at Majdanek. The majority of them arrived in the camp as forced laborers, and either died as a result of the brutally inhumane living conditions, or were killed in the gas chambers after the Germans determined that they could no longer work. Because of the workload and frequent assemblies, Braunsteiner had regularly been replacing the main supervisor, Elsa Erich, and she was not only involved in the selections of the women and children to be sent to the gas chambers, but she was almost always present when the gas executions were taking place. Majdanek's gas chambers were also used to kill prisoners from the other camps in Lublin, who were no longer able to work. Some Jewish victims were killed in the gas chambers upon arrival. Many, however, were killed in shooting operations, and many others died of disease, starvation, exposure, and overwork. Though it served primarily as a vast forced labor camp for the Polish Jews, Majdanek also served as a detention center for real and suspected members of the Polish underground resistance in German-occupied Poland, and for Poles suspected of violating the harsh provisions issued by the German occupation authorities that governed the labor discipline. Next to the Jews, Poles represented the largest minority in the camp. Other prisoners at Majdanek included Germans, Austrians, Czechs, Ukrainians, Soviet prisoners of war and Soviet civilians, and a handful of others. At Majdanek, Braunsteiner showed her superiority towards the prisoners by treating them brutally and inhumanely, and she used every opportunity to harass and humiliate the women. She became infamous for her wild rages and tantrums, and the women at the camp described her as inhuman, cruel, brutal, sadistic, and causing frantic fear. Not only did she beat them, but also killed them by stomping on them with her steel-studded jackboots, which earned her the nickname, the Stomping Mare. Another Braunsteiner specialty at Majdanek was whipping. She would whip several women, including those who were pregnant, to death. She was particularly notable for her cruel treatment of children, whom she saw as useless eaters. She would whip the children, and on a few occasions, she was seen grabbing children by the hair and throwing them on the trucks heading to the gas chambers. She would pull the children's hair so hard that whole tufts would remain in her hands. She punished the children with beatings and lashes, even if they rushed towards the food bucket, or if they did not sew on their inmate number correctly. On one occasion, a child had been hidden in a rucksack by his father when they arrived at the camp. However, as the child moved, Braunsteiner noticed it, and she whipped a man so hard that the child hidden in the rucksack cried out. She then killed the child on the spot. In a camp, Braunsteiner was often accompanied by a German shepherd, which she used to bait the prisoners. On one occasion, Braunsteiner was telling the female prisoners to give their children away because the children were going to a summer camp where they would get milk 2 times a day. Because the mothers knew what would happen, they didn't want to give up their children. Braunsteiner started hitting one woman with a child so brutally that the woman fell down. The mother and the child died on the spot. After the suppression of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, which started on the 19th of April, 1943, a large part of the surviving Jews were transported to the concentration camp at Majdanek. SS female supervisors, including Braunsteiner and other SS men, prevented the children from escaping, beat them and hit them with a whip, and then captured them again. For her work, she received the War Merit Cross, 2nd class, in 1943. During the spring of 1944, the SS evacuated most of the prisoners to concentration camps further west. In late July 1944, as Soviet forces approached Lublin, the remaining camp staff hastily abandoned Majdanek. However, in their urgency to flee the camp, they neglected to destroy most of the prisoner barracks and the gas chambers. When the Soviet army liberated the camp on the 24th of July 1944, it was virtually intact and only a few hundred Jewish prisoners remained alive. Soviet officials invited journalists to inspect the camp and evidence of the horrors that had occurred there. Between 80 and 120,000 people perished in Majdanek between October 1941 and July 1944, when the camp was operational. When the Soviet army liberated Majdanek, Hermine Braunsteiner was already in Genthin subcamp of Ravensbrück, located outside Berlin. She was the main supervisor of over 14 SS women and the head of the Genthin subcamp. Braunsteiner served there until May 1945. After the surrendering of Genthin camp on the 7th of May 1945, she escaped from the Soviet troops to the western zones of occupation. After the war, survivors testified how she had abused many of the Genthin prisoners with a horsewhip she carried, killing at least 2 women with it. After the war, Braunsteiner worked for 3 months on a farm in Bavaria, and in October 1945, she came back to her mother in Vienna, where she worked as a housekeeper until January 1946. On the 6th of May 1946, Austrian police arrested Braunsteiner and turned her over to the British military occupation authorities. She was held in various internment camps until the 18th of April 1947, when she was released. On the 7th of April 1948, Braunsteiner was rearrested by the Austrian officials due to her activity as a camp supervisor in Ravensbrück. On the 22nd of November, Braunsteiner was convicted of abusing the prisoners and violation of humanity and dignity in Ravensbrück, but acquitted of her crimes in Majdanek due to lack of witnesses. Braunsteiner was sentenced to only 3 years in prison and had her property confiscated. Since the detention ward and detention center for interned were included, she served her sentence only until April 1950, when she was released. She then worked at low-level jobs until the mid-1950s, when she met Russell Ryan, with whom she emigrated to Canada in 1958. They got married, and Braunsteiner took her husband's name, Ryan. They moved to the United States and lived in New York, where Russell worked as a precise mechanic and Hermine in a jersey factory. She told neither her husband nor the American authorities about her work in the concentration camps. In January 1963, Hermine Ryan Braunsteiner was granted an American citizenship, losing her Austrian one at the same time. However, a year later she was tracked down by Simon Wiesenthal, a Jewish Austrian Holocaust survivor and Nazi hunter. The first press release about Hermine as a Ravensbrück and Majdanek supervisor appeared. Because she did not include this information in the application for her American citizenship, the United States Citizenship and Immigration Services initiated an action depriving her of American citizenship. In September 1971, Hermine gave up her American citizenship. In 1973, when she was arrested and expelled to Germany, Russell Ryan, Hermine's husband, told the reporter, "There's no more decent person on this earth than my wife. She wouldn't hurt a fly." Hermine Braunsteiner Ryan was tried at the Third Majdanek trial, which lasted from November 1975 until June 1981. During the trial, she experienced 2 mental breakdowns, and there were even reports that she solved a crossword puzzle during proceedings. During her testimony, she pounded her hands against the table and screamed at one of the witnesses, "This woman should be telling the truth. I did not shoot any boy." Then, during a break, she offended another witness, saying, "You liar, you should be telling the truth." Braunsteiner tried to diminish her role in the camps and invoke having been merely a small cog in a large wheel of a very powerful state crime apparatus. During the trial, she wrote her friend, "My dear friend, I can thank for all this to Jews in German state who found it necessary after 34 years to prosecute me and who request my extradition so that I can again be convicted for everything that was back then ordered and carried out by German state." Braunsteiner said that she had never done anything worse than slap some prisoners at the Ravensbrück concentration camp, and when asked whether she had done anything during her time at the camps that she was ashamed of, Hermine Braunsteiner, the stomping mayor of Majdanek, answered simply, no. She was convicted of 3 out of 9 counts: the murder of 80 people, abetting in the murder of 102 children, and collaborating in the murder of 1,000 people. On the 30th of June, 1981, the court sentenced Hermine Braunsteiner to life imprisonment. However, due to complications of diabetes, including a leg amputation, Braunsteiner was released in 1996. After leaving the prison, she lived with her husband Russell in an apartment in Linden District in Bochum. She spent her last years moving in a wheelchair and suffered from diabetes and arthritis. She was 79 years old when she died on the 19th of April, 1999. There were no tears shed for Hermine Braunsteiner. Thanks for watching the World History Channel. Please help us to create more videos by clicking on the donation link. Thank you, and see you next time on the channel.